A single crumpled dollar trembled in Silas Mercer's weathered hand, catching the light like a fragile spark of defiance. The entire town square seemed to freeze. Dust hung in the hot air, swirling around the circle of men who jeered, spat, and laughed at the gray-haired stranger daring to challenge their cruel spectacle. On the rough wooden platform, a young girl stood with shackled wrists, her dark skin bruised and bloodied. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. Her eyes, piercing and unbroken, met Silas's. And in that silent exchange, something far larger than either of them began. The auctioneer's hammer fell like a gunshot. For one single dollar, Silas had purchased a life and ignited a storm of blood, betrayal, and vengeance that would engulf all of Milbrook. The sun blazed over Milbrook like a merciless overseer, flattening every shadow and coating the dusty town square in a suffocating heat. Silas Mercer tugged his hat lower against the glare, guiding his bay horse along the dirt street. He had come to town for a simple errand: pick up a sack of grain, maybe a warm meal and a drink before heading back to the quiet of his homestead. But a sound cut through the stillness: jeering, hooting, and the metallic clatter of chains. He slowed the horse, frowning, and followed the noise toward the center of town. What he saw made his stomach knot. A rough wooden platform had been erected in front of the general store. On it stood a young woman, her wrists shackled together, iron glinting in the sun. Her dress was torn, her arms streaked with dirt and bruises that told a story no words could. She couldn't have been more than 19. Her name, he would later learn, was Amara Duval. She didn't bow her head or cry. Her eyes were what stopped Silas cold, dark, steady, and burning with a quiet defiance. Even in chains, she refused to look broken. The auctioneer, a slick-haired man with sweat-stained clothes, raised his voice above the muttering crowd. "Strong girl, healthy, worth every penny. We start at $50. A man with tobacco-stained teeth spat in the dirt and lifted his hand. "55. The bidding rolled on, the numbers climbing. 60, 65, 75. Each call was met with laughter and lewd remarks from men packed shoulder to shoulder under the punishing sun. Silas felt his chest tighten. It had been 6 years since the war ended, 6 years since the papers said that human beings could no longer be bought and sold. Yet here it was, uglier than ever, hidden in plain sight. His hands tightened on the reins. A memory rose, unbidden and sharp. Sarah. His little girl had once clutched his finger, with a hand so small it barely wrapped around. He'd held her as fever burned through her body, whispering lullabies to a child who could no longer hear him. He'd buried her on a cold spring morning, a white ribbon tied around a wooden cross. He couldn't save Sarah, but he could save this girl. The auctioneer's voice snapped him back to the present. 75. Do I hear 80? Silas felt something shift in his chest, a mix of grief, rage, and a quiet, unshakable resolve. He slipped a hand into his coat and pulled out a single, worn $1 bill. He raised it high. $1. The square went silent. Then the laughter hit like a slap. "Ha! Did the old man hit his head? A dollar ain't worth the dust on her feet. Look at him. Thinks he's a savior." Spit landed near his boots, but Silas didn't flinch. He kept his arms steady, though the bill trembled in his hand. His voice carried, calm and unwavering. $1, he said again. At the edge of the platform, Sheriff Carver, a broad man with a smug smile and a badge dulled by neglect, folded his arms. He studied Silas like a cat watching a mouse wander into a trap. Finally, he gave a lazy nod. "Let him have her. Let's see what a single dollar buys a man these days." The auctioneer hesitated, then brought the gavel down with a sharp crack. "Sold!" Silas dismounted and approached the platform. The blacksmith unfastened the shackles with a metallic clink that echoed like church bells in the hot air. Amara stepped down carefully, her ankles stiff from standing too long in irons. For the briefest moment, their eyes met. It wasn't gratitude he saw, it was recognition. A silent understanding passed between them. Her life had changed, and so had his. He led her toward the edge of town, the laughter of the crowd fading behind them. Dust swirled around their boots as the sun beat down, heavy and unforgiving. Silas felt the weight of that single dollar in his pocket like a brand. He did not see Sheriff Carver's smirk follow him, nor the sharp eyes watching from the shade of the saloon. He did not yet realize that saving a life in Milbrook meant declaring war. With each step away from the square, Silas Mercer unknowingly walked into a deadly trap, one that would test the limits of courage, justice, and the price of a man's soul. The road out of Milbrook was little more than a scar of packed dirt winding toward the open prairie. Silas Mercer led Amara Duval along the edge of town, his hand resting lightly on the reins of his horse as the girl limped beside him. Her ankles were stiff, the skin raw from the iron shackles that had bound her for God knew how long. The sun was dropping toward the horizon now, spilling red and gold across the land, but the heat still clung to them like a second skin. "You can rest once we hit the river," Silas said quietly. "It's not far. You head north from there, and no one will follow you." Amara's voice was soft but edged with steel. "You don't understand. They'll never let you walk away." Silas stopped, frowning. He scanned the empty street behind them. The town looked calm, the saloon doors swinging lazily in the hot wind. But the girl's words carried the weight of certainty. "Who won't?" he asked. "All of them," she said, eyes fixed on the horizon. "The sheriff, the men who paid to see me sold, the one they're really waiting for. You didn't buy freedom, you just painted a target on your back." The words had barely left her lips when hoofbeats thundered from behind. Silas turned, and the sight that met him made his jaw tighten. Sheriff Carver rode at the head of a small group, his tan duster flaring in the wind, a smirk plastered across his sunburned face. Beside him loomed Garrison Steeljaw Pike, the bounty hunter whose name traveled like smoke across 3 territories. He was massive, broad-shouldered, with a scar raking down his jaw. When he smiled, the sunlight caught on the metallic glint of his steel-capped teeth. Carver pulled his horse to a stop just a few yards away, letting the dust settle between them. His voice carried across the still evening air. "That girl's spoken for, Mercer. Pike here rode 200 miles for her. You bought yourself trouble, old man." Pike's grin was a predator's smile. He spat a stream of tobacco-stained saliva into the dirt. "Step aside, graybeard. This here ain't your business. Hand her over, and maybe we let you ride out with your skin intact." Silas's hand hovered near the worn handle of his revolver, but he didn't draw. Not yet. His heartbeat was steady, but a cold weight pressed into his chest. He had known deep down that the dollar he raised in the square had lit a fire he might not survive. "You running a slave auction in broad daylight now, Carver?" Silas said evenly. "War ended 6 years ago." Carver's smirk widened, his teeth yellow against his tan skin. "War ended, sure, but laws whatever men like us can enforce. And today the law says she goes with Pike." Amara stood silent beside Silas, her eyes fixed on the bounty hunter. For a moment the prairie held its breath. The low wind whispered through dry grass, and somewhere far off, a coyote barked. Then another sound broke the stillness, the rhythmic clatter of hooves, heavier and more disciplined than the first group. Silas's gut clenched. From the ridge to the east rode a small troop of Union soldiers, blue coats dusty but orderly, rifles slung over their shoulders. At their head was Captain Elias Ward, a lean man with prematurely gray hair and eyes like ice chips. He reined his horse in with practiced ease, scanning the scene below him with an expression that was neither surprise nor concern. "Well now," Ward said, his voice cold and even. "What an interesting gathering." Carver's smirk faltered for just a moment. "Evening, Captain. Just local business. Nothing for the army to trouble itself over." Ward's gaze swept from Carver to Pike, then landed on Amara. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, but his tone remained flat. "Miss Duval, your father would want you to come quietly." Silas felt a shiver crawl down his spine. The world seemed to tilt in that moment. This wasn't about a single illegal auction. This wasn't about a bounty hunter's payday. This was bigger, something coiled and rotten, stretching far beyond Milbrook. Amara's jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch under Ward's stare. Silas noticed her fingers twitch, as if she wanted to reach for something. Freedom, safety, maybe a weapon. "What's going on here?" Silas asked, voice low. Ward's cold smile didn't reach his eyes. "Power, Mr. Mercer, secrets, and the blood of anyone foolish enough to get in the way." Silas Mercer had spent a lifetime walking away from other men's sins, convincing himself that survival meant keeping his head down. But standing between Amara Duval and the three predators circling her, he felt the weight of a decision settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about slavery. It was about power, secrets, and blood. And by lifting that single trembling dollar in Milbrook Square, he had just stepped into the center of it all. The canyon walls rose like jagged teeth on either side of the narrow trail, the late afternoon sun bleeding red against the rock. Silas Mercer had hoped to outpace the riders chasing them, but the hoofbeats behind him echoed like a drumbeat of inevitability. Dust rose from the dry ground with each gallop, coating his mouth with grit. Ahead, Amara clung to the saddle, her posture rigid, eyes darting to every shadow along the canyon rim. She didn't need to speak. They both knew the danger pressing in on them from every direction. Then the first rifle shot cracked through the air. A splinter of rock burst near Silas's head, stinging his cheek. Instinct took over. He pulled the horse toward a cluster of boulders, sliding off and yanking Amara down behind cover. Gunfire erupted from the canyon walls. Echoes made it impossible to tell where the bullets came from, but Silas caught sight of riders moving along the high ground, Sheriff Carver and Steeljaw Pike among them. "Keep your head down," Silas barked, his revolver already in hand. Another shot rang out, this one sparking off the stone just inches from Amara's face. She flinched but didn't scream. Her composure under fire startled Silas. He had seen grown men break for less. Then the canyon filled with the thunder of a second set of hoofbeats. Down the trail rode Captain Elias Ward and his blue-coated soldiers, rifles raised. The air crackled with shouted orders and the sharp report of gunfire as Ward's men fired toward the ridges, not caring if bullets hit Carver's riders or Silas himself. In the chaos, a leather satchel tumbled from one of Ward's soldiers, knocked free by a ricochet. It hit the dirt just feet from Amara, spilling papers into the wind. She lunged instinctively, crawling through the dust and scooping up the satchel. Silas wanted to shout for her to leave it, but something in her eyes, an almost feral determination, stopped him. Bullets whined past as she opened the bag behind their boulder. Inside lay documents sealed with military insignia, official letters, and a small leather-bound ledger. Across the top page, bold letters read, "The Washington Protocols." Her breath caught. Her fingers trembled as she turned the pages, scanning the words. Silas saw lists of names, maps, and columns of numbers. Post-war land seizures, bribes, illegal slave auctions disguised as military contracts. Her voice was low, sharp with fury. "My father, he documented all of this." Silas blinked. "Your father?" Amara nodded, jaw tight. "He was a federal clerk in Washington. He thought if he recorded every deal, every crime, he could protect the freedmen, maybe bring justice. But instead," her voice faltered, then hardened. "They killed him, shot him in the street, and called it an accident." Silas's stomach knotted. He looked at the papers again and understood. This wasn't just corruption. It was a network of power built on blood and stolen freedom. Men like Carver and Pike were pawns, but Ward was playing for something bigger. Gunfire snapped him back to reality. A bullet tore through his coat, grazing his shoulder. Pain flared hot and sharp. "We can't stay here," Silas hissed. "Move!" They scrambled along the canyon floor, weaving between rocks as the factions above fired at each other as much as at them. Dust choked the air, and the smell of gunpowder stung their noses. Behind them, Carver shouted over the chaos. "Don't let him get away! Pike, cut him off!" But Silas knew the terrain better than most. He led Amara through a dry creek bed that snaked out of the canyon, emerging onto rolling scrubland dotted with thorny bushes. The open land was dangerous, but they needed distance more than cover. For hours they rode hard, pushing the horse to its limits. Behind them, the sound of pursuit faded into the wind. When the sun dipped behind the horizon, the prairie turned cold, the sky bruised purple and gray. Finally, Silas spotted a cluster of abandoned buildings at the edge of a dry gulch. Weathered wood, sagging roofs, a rusted sign swinging from a bent nail. An old mining town, long since left to ghosts. He slowed the horse, scanning the area. "We'll rest here. Maybe hide till dawn. They dismounted, moving cautiously through the hollow streets. Broken windows gaped like missing teeth. The faint creak of wood under their boots echoed in the stillness. Amara clutched the satchel to her chest as if it were a lifeline. Her voice was barely a whisper. They'll never stop, Silas. Not until they get these papers, or we're dead. Silas met her gaze in the fading light. He'd never wanted a fight like this, never wanted to carry anyone else's war. But looking at the bruised young woman holding the weight of truth and betrayal in her hands, he knew there was no walking away now. He nodded toward a building with a collapsed porch. We'll hole up here. Tomorrow, we figure out how to end this. As the night wind whistled through the empty town, carrying whispers of old miners in the faint smell of dust and rust, Silas Mercer realized he was no longer just a farmer passing through. He was the reluctant guardian of a girl and the truth, and both were worth more than any dollar he had ever held. Night crept over the abandoned mining town like a slow tide, swallowing the last streaks of red and gold from the horizon. The wind carried a low, mournful whistle through the hollow streets, rattling loose shutters and whispering across the rotting wood of old porches. Lantern light flickered against leaning walls and broken windows, casting long, restless shadows that made the place feel alive with ghosts. Silas Mercer sat with his back against a cracked doorframe, the cool night air pressing through the holes in his coat. Beside him, Amara Duval cradled the leather satchel of stolen truths, the Washington protocols, as if they were more fragile than life itself. The town was silent except for the distant creak of abandoned mine shafts and the soft clink of iron as Silas checked his revolver. They had barricaded themselves as best they could. Wooden planks and overturned furniture blocked the doorways. Loose stones were piled against windows to serve as makeshift cover. Their world now was a fragile fortress of shadows and dust, one that would either hold or become their tomb. Silas's gaze drifted to the flicker of the lantern, and with it came the memory of Sarah, his little girl. He saw her as she had been, brown hair tangled, cheeks flushed with fever, tiny hands clutching his finger. He had whispered to her in those last hours, promising that the world could still be kind, that he would always protect her, but he had failed her. He had watched death come quietly and take the one thing he loved most, powerless to stop it. A lump formed in his throat as he glanced at Amara. She sat with her back straight despite exhaustion, her eyes sharp even in the wavering light. She refused to be broken, and in her Silas saw the echo of Sarah, the same stubborn spark that refused to be snuffed out. The weight of what they carried pressed heavily on his chest, not just the documents, but the truth itself, the corruption, the stolen lives, the silent suffering that men like Carver and Ward had built their fortunes on. He murmured into the quiet, almost to himself, "Sometimes doing the right thing don't feel like winning. Feels like walking into your own grave." Amara didn't look away from the darkness outside. "Then we walk," she said softly. They waited through the long hours of night, every creak of the old town setting their nerves on edge. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The cold crept in, and Silas felt it in his bones. He dozed in brief, uneasy stretches, dreaming of gunfire and the echo of Sarah's laughter. When the first light of dawn bled over the ridges, the sound they had dreaded arrived. Hoofbeats, then the distant clatter of wagon wheels and the metallic rhythm of rifles striking against saddles. The attackers had come. Silas peered through a gap in the boarded window and counted shadows moving between the morning fog and the pale sun. Steeljaw Pike's mercenaries fanned out like wolves, their grins visible even at a distance. Behind them, Captain Elias Ward's soldiers approached with grim efficiency, rifles ready. "They're here," Silas muttered. The first shot cracked through the brittle morning, shattering a window and spraying splinters across the floor. Silas ducked, heart pounding. The town erupted in chaos as bullets ricocheted off wood and stone, each impact echoing like a hammer in the cold air. Amara crouched behind the overturned table, gripping a revolver she'd taken from the mine office. Her knuckles were white, but her hands were steady. The attackers surged forward, filling the main street with the thunder of boots and hooves. Silas fired from the window, the recoil biting into his shoulder. A mercenary dropped, another cursed and ducked behind a trough. Dust and gunpowder filled the air, turning the mine into a roaring furnace of violence. Through the haze, Silas saw a figure darting between shadows. Tobias Crane, the old mine foreman, and his one trusted friend in Milbrook. Somehow he had slipped into town during the night. Silas caught a glimpse of him vanishing into the old telegraph office, a wire coiled around his shoulder. The assault raged as the sun climbed higher, illuminating the hollow battlefield. Bullets shredded wood, and chunks of stone flew from the mine's outer wall. Silas felt time stretch into something unreal, his world reduced to the rhythm of loading, firing, ducking, and praying. Somewhere amid the chaos, the distant clack of a telegraph key began to tap, a desperate message flying through wires toward the nearest federal outpost. If the reinforcements came in time, they might live. If not, this ghost town would become their last stand, and the Washington protocols would die with them. Silas pressed his back against the wall, sweat and dust mixing on his skin. Across the room, Amara met his eyes with a steady, unflinching stare. Neither spoke, but the unspoken vow was clear. They would not let evil walk unchallenged, even if it cost them their lives. The sun crept over the jagged ridges, painting the abandoned mining town in pale gold. Smoke drifted from shattered windows, and the air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and scorched wood. Silas Mercer crouched behind the broken wall of the mine office, his revolver heavy in his hand, his lungs burning from dust and adrenaline. Across from him, Amara Duval clutched the Washington protocols against her chest, her dark eyes scanning the ruins for any movement. The first light of morning revealed the enemy. Steeljaw Pike strode into the main street like a predator, his steel-capped teeth glinting in the dawn. Behind him, Sheriff Carver barked orders, while Captain Elias Ward and his soldiers flanked the edges of the ghost town, rifles raised. The battlefield smelled of desperation. "Mercer!" Pike's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "You can't win this. Hand over the girl and the papers, and I'll make your death quick." Silas rose slowly from cover, his revolver aimed, dust clinging to his sweat-soaked coat. "You'll have to come take 'em," he said evenly. Pike's grin widened. He charged, firing his revolver. The shot tore through Silas's sleeve as he dove aside, rolling across the dirt. He fired back, the bullet grazing Pike's shoulder. The bounty hunter barely flinched. They collided in the street, fists and guns clashing in a brutal dance. Pike swung like a hammer, his fist slamming into Silas's ribs. Pain blossomed, but Silas held on, grappling for the revolver in Pike's other hand. The two men crashed into the side of a water trough, splinters flying. Pike lunged with a knife, catching Silas's sleeve. But the older man twisted, driving his elbow into the bounty hunter's jaw. The impact rang against steel teeth. Pike staggered, and for a heartbeat, his eyes widened in shock. Silas didn't hesitate. He raised his revolver and fired. The shot echoed like a thunderclap. Steeljaw Pike crumpled to the dirt, the metallic glint of his infamous teeth catching the morning light one last time. Across the street, the battle raged on. Sheriff Carver turned toward Captain Ward, panic creeping into his voice. "We need to fall back. That farmer's not alone anymore." Ward's expression hardened. "You're a liability, Carver." The pistol barked once. Carver's eyes went wide as he clutched his chest, stumbling backward into the dirt. The sheriff of Milbrook, the man who had sold human lives with a smirk, died face first in the same dust he had ruled over. Then came the horn blast. From the northern ridge, a column of federal reinforcements thundered into the valley, sabers flashing, uniforms dusty but unmistakable. Tobias Crane's telegraph had found its mark. Ward's soldiers faltered, caught between loyalty and fear. Shots rang out as the army surrounded the ghost town. Ward tried to run, spurring his horse toward the canyon, but a well-placed rifle shot from the ridge sent him tumbling into the dirt. He rose to his knees, hands trembling, as federal soldiers closed in. The cold-eyed officer who had orchestrated months of bloodshed and betrayal was finally in chains. Silas staggered to his feet, bruised and bloodied, as Amara stepped from the mine office. She held the Washington protocols high, her voice clear despite exhaustion. "These papers hold the truth," she said to the soldiers. "Names, dates, crimes that reached to the highest offices." The commander took the satchel, his face grim as he flipped through the documents. He didn't need long to understand the weight of what he held. In the weeks that followed, the protocols became a hammer that shattered the rotten core of post-war corruption. Judges were arrested. Military officers faced courts-martial. Illegal slave traders fled or swung from the gallows. The Washington Protocols turned the tide of a war that had supposedly ended 6 years earlier, proving that justice often comes long after the shooting stops. Silas stayed on the edge of it all, watching from a distance as Amara testified, her voice steady and fearless. He didn't need credit, and he didn't seek it. He had made his choice the moment he raised that trembling dollar in the Milbrook Square. Weeks later, Silas stood alone at sunrise, leaning on a weathered fence at the edge of town. The air was crisp, the sky painted with the soft colors of dawn. He thought of Sarah, of the life he couldn't save, and of the girl who had carried a nation's truth in her hands. A single dollar had bought a life, but it had also bought justice, redemption, and a small ripple that would travel far beyond the dusty streets of Milbrook. He breathed in the cold morning air and whispered to the empty horizon. Sometimes the smallest gesture changes everything. One man, $1. One choice that refused to be silent. The sun climbed higher, burning the last of the shadows from the ghost town, and with it, Silas Mercer felt the faint stirrings of peace, a feeling he thought he'd buried with his daughter. And so, from a single trembling dollar raised in a dusty 1871 town square, a life was saved, justice was sparked, and a ripple of courage spread through history. Silas Mercer never imagined that such a small act would change so many lives. He simply refused to look away from evil. Even today, more than a century later, this story still speaks to us. We might not face dusty auctions or outlaw gunmen, but we all face moments where doing the right thing feels risky, lonely, or small. Maybe it's standing up to unfairness at work, speaking out when someone is being mistreated, or helping a neighbor who has no one else. These little choices may feel insignificant, but as Silas showed us, a single gesture can echo for generations. I want to ask you, have you ever seen a small act of courage change a life? Or do you believe that in today's world, one person can still make a difference the way Silas did? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to read your stories and see how this lesson lives on in our modern lives. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it moved you, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next powerful story from our frontier of history and heart. Remember, sometimes the quietest choices speak the loudest. And maybe, just maybe, your next small act could be the one that changes someone's world.